Nate, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, you bet.
Awesome, man. Hey, welcome. So glad to have you. Let's just get right into it with the intro. So, in addition to being one of the coolest dudes I know from legendary North Little Rock punk rock band, and also Little Rock punk rock band, because there's so many members, probably all over Arkansas punk rock band, Sufi Nun Squad. This is the legendary Nate Powell. And so Nate Powell is an author, and that is why we are here today at the Six Bridges Book Festival. Nate Powell is an Arkansas native, and he's the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award. In addition to his newest book, Powell's work includes civil rights icon John Lewis's historic March trilogy, Come Again, and Two Dead. He lives in Bloomington, Indiana currently, and Save It for Later, Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest is his memoir and essay hybrid, and it documents his experience as a parent helping his children process an ongoing struggle for the survival of democracy. It offers a fresh account of real-time social upheaval through a pandemic and mass mobilization against white supremacy. Powell also focuses on the fragile community connections, the mainstreaming of fascist aesthetic and pop culture, and the equipping of young people with empathy and the skills to determine their own roles in an increasingly uncertain future, really. And thanks to the Six Bridges Book Festivals for writing that intro. I really appreciate that. So without further ado, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to the Cal Six Bridges website for this Zoom. I'd like to welcome Nate Powell. Welcome, Nate.
Glad to be here. Good to see you, Mike.
Dude, glad to be here too. I'm right here in Atlanta now, where it's currently 9 o'clock. And I had a heck of a time moving things around because I forgot that there was a time change in Atlanta, that they were actually on Eastern. So I'm super stoked that everything came the way it did and everything's worked out perfectly this week. How's your week been?
It's been pretty good. It's been pretty quiet. I mean, like all in all, I'm sort of in between, active steps on different books I'm doing. So I've just kind of been happily enjoying the fall weather and inking one of my new books and listening to music and kind of getting in dad mode, preparing for Halloween.
Well, I follow you religiously, so I'm seeing the new inkings and getting excited to get the books. And I went through, like, I own almost everything I think that you've made that I've been aware of. And I went back through it in preparation for this. And I even read the book we're focusing on another half dozen times over the past month. Man, I love it. I really do. It's enjoyable when you take away something different, like the minutest detail, like a really familiar film, like we were talking about earlier, that you remember every holiday season. And so there were some things that I needed to have back in my memory, not only for just making notes and having this conversation, but to also, these are memories I needed to be reminded of, and I think we all did. And man, I'm just so grateful for you taking the time to write this and to do the art and everything that you do as a graphic novelist to make this happen.
You bet. And I mean, like, I guess the way that you kind of framed that in terms of remaining connected to the ways that certain experiences felt and like digging up the embers of memories that were fading, like really the impetus for making Save It for Later goes back to late 2017. And it was in recognizing that even 1 year or less than a year into the previous occupant of the White House, the race towards authoritarianism was so fast and so on so many fronts that people were rising to the challenge. There were, 100 fires burning. There still are 100 fires burning, if not more. But frankly, it was the fact that very quickly, not only had some of the more private applications of life under this race towards authoritarianism, some of those details had begun to kind of get swept under our individual rugs along the way.
Right.
And a lot of it, that makes sense. It's like, we do have to pick our battles. We need to, be working on what's burning the brightest. But at the same time, I think a lot of the recovery on a societal level and a lot of our ability to prevent a successful fascist movement or a successful authoritarian regime from really installing itself. It depends on our ability to actually remember vividly what those experiences were like. And that's across most of the political spectrum. I think this is really where I think a false right-left narrative hurts us. I think a lot of even moderately conservative people felt a lot of the same sense of anxiety, disappointment, dread, uncertainty, and anxiety, doom. It just got normalized a lot faster. So that was sort of my impetus for really getting a lot of these things down. It worked on a therapy level, on a clarifying my thoughts level, and as the work continued, connections started to be made so that some of these accounts were tied in with different essays I had going that were a little bit more political and a little more objective.
And that speaks to me, just going back from the start of this book, the very first dialogue in that happens is from, I'm guessing, a parent friend of yours that says black. I just felt like it was the best choice. And that might not be verbatim, but I wear it all the time. This is all I wear. And it's I'm really great because I have this other red shirt that I was going to wear. We'd look too similar. If I'd worn that, it would look really bizarre. But to me, both of those things together speak to the fact that it's I feel like people don't even remember the Black Lives Matter movement from last year. You know what I'm saying? I feel like things move so fast that it's easier for a potential regime like this, or the potential of the corporations and groups in power that get to write the narrative and own the media and push their programs, is to help us forget that and to make it think that it wasn't that big of a deal, like the insurgency, they're kind of sweeping that under the rug, which is kind of the way unfortunately this movement has been ever since it's happened. It's, hey, look at this, and then, hey, sweep that under the rug every time.
Certainly. So, I think there's definitely a fatigue factor for a lot of people, but a lot of that simply comes back to, especially for a lot of white Americans, is recognizing that there is a comfort zone that people have the privilege of retreating back into. And so, yes, it's okay. Everybody needs to take time to get on top of their stuff, to heal, to reorganize and regroup. But, I'm as guilty as anyone else. It's easy to check out. And so it was really weird to finish this book, to finish all of it except for one chapter in January of 2020, before the world shut down. And then to basically kind of try to tie the whole room together and condense a lot of the experiences of the first half of 2020 into a chapter that would kind of bring the book into the future. However, I had to finish the book and get it off to the printer even before Election Day 2020. So I've never quite had a writing challenge. In particular, making a nonfiction book that was memoir that was effectively that needed to hold true regardless of electoral outcome, and just racing into an utterly unknown future. And so I think I was successful at communicating what I wanted to communicate in a way that held true regardless of what occurred between November and January. Sure. But I think that's all the more reason to be shouting the alarms and to keep the pressure up as high as possible.
Absolutely. I tell my friends I was just spending some time with up here, and tell friends all the time that have children, I can't fathom what you're thinking. I can't fathom what you're going through. The present and what we've just gone through in the past 4 years means so much more to parents than I can imagine, because I don't have kids, because I haven't had a family. So although I absolutely feel like all children are the future children for me, and I'm trying to be a better person for all of them, I can't imagine just the way that it felt being a parent. And I love, I like the use of the word anamorphic, the way you had the adorable unicorn daughter that is kind of, our hero through this story. And sharing the way she thought, it really made me emotional. And I'm wondering, like, how emotional it made you during that time. I know there were your hot buttered noodles nights, but I mean, I'm wondering, like, like, especially with all of those pressures of being a parent, all of those pressures of the current administration that was happening, and then this pandemic, did this feel like it was all of this type of movement was about to completely take a reversal? Did it feel like we were about to go to a turn to the worse for you? Because I absolutely did. I had no 100% assurance, just like you didn't have a real assurance that Clinton was going to win, that this was going to happen, that we would, be at least moving away from it.
Certainly.
Did you?
I think I give off a little bit of a misleading sense of being an optimist because I have a very sunny disposition, but I generally, like, in terms of social and political outlook, I have not been optimistic through, the past 5 or 6 years. And I think that, it's consistent with how I've been through my adult life, but I think it has really helped me be able to register the stakes and the danger appropriately, even though it kind of like makes me Debbie Downer sometimes.
Sure.
It also, I think, has been helpful to equip my kids at their level. And throughout the course of Save It for Later, I'm largely focusing on my experiences with my older daughter, who's almost 10 now. But most of this story covers her being, 3 to 7 years old within that window. But it allowed me, I guess, a better space by which to be ready to listen and to understand that a kid who's even like 5 years old is already picking up on so much and is already equipped with a volley of questions that you need to be prepared to unpack and to answer at their level. And so a lot of that, like a lot of the narratives that take place within the book that are conversations, especially between my daughter and I, it sort of navigates when, as a parent, you need to understand when is too much and when is too little to explain. And basically, like, whenever possible, I try to have my own character being the fool or putting my own foot in my mouth or being, overconfident to a fault. Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's a no joke situation, but like, you also have to like understand exactly where the line is, where you're not scaring your child, you're equipping them with a certain sense of caution and gravity. But you have to, it takes mistakes. It takes accidentally scaring the crap out of your kid, explaining the darkness of the world before you recognize how to not do that again.
Man, I completely understand that. And for me, that was one of the best parts of the book. Each time that I read it was when your daughter comes to you and she's ready for that to be her nighttime book. And then you explain how it was different each time she read it, which is kind of like I'm saying, there's new details you get each time you read it. But I know that every time, like, it makes me really excited to see like your drawn hand there going, I know, when she's like, you can't own a person. And you're like, I know, it's insane. We don't own people. It makes no sense. And so for me, I guess you've let me know, like, kind of what she thought each time. I'm curious to know, like, since you've written the book and since it's been covered and you've had talks like these, what other subtle nuances have you noticed about your work at that time and this story and that you put together?
I'd say, like, looking back, it's weird. I feel like because time is so disjointed right now.
Right.
Besides the fact that, like, I finished the book a year ago and it's been in people's hands for almost 7 months now, there's still this sense that I feel like I have very little room to reflect on it. Right. Some of it is there's a part of my mind that's very grateful that I have 2 new books to move forward on. But also I think the part of it is like because Save It for Later, because like 2/3 of it is processing actual things that happen in my family's lives and conversations we've had. There's a part of it that feels like, I mean, I do reread it and reflect upon it, but I don't really get hung up on that. Like, I feel like I'm not at a stage where I'm really looking at, like, I'm very satisfied with the communication and the messaging within the book. I'm not really looking critically at like the more formal elements of how I made the comic. But it's also interesting because now my older daughter, who's almost 10, is old enough that just a couple of weeks ago, you know, she was finally like, can I at least have my own copy to Save It for Later? And I was like, okay. And I was like, this is the real test. I'm handing it off to, like, this is the moment that I was dreading for years. Be like, well, here I am drawing my family in this book. It's only a matter of time before, you know, like my kid is old enough to be like, come on. But,
Right.
you know, like it's interesting in that that's sort of the next step of the last 6 years of our lives where that daughter of mine, her worldview was really deeply informed by my work on March. You know, she was born the same week I started working on March. And so she was literally surrounded by this history and by these images of protest and regular kind of, you know, adjacency to the late, great John Lewis. And so reading March together as she grew was such a formative component that, you know, it's kind of nice to step that up. More important than that, over the last year, she and I have been reading every night the entire 16-year run of Chris Claremont writing the Uncanny X-Men from the mid 70s to the early 90s. And we're almost done now. But I mean, X-Men gave me my social conscience as an 11 and 12-year-old. Like, it was thrash metal and X-Men that did the trick. And so it's been really valuable to read this again with my kid after March and after living through and having our family shaped by, you know, showing up and doing our part in society, or trying to. But so many of the issues and so many components of otherness and discrimination and oppression and action are just so tangible in the pages of X-Men. And it's given me way more conversational points and time through that comic than I frankly expected it to.
Yeah, I'm frankly, I get excited that Chris Terry posts the pictures of comic books he's found at the store.
Oh, yeah.
I'm getting more excited about that than I should. Like, I wasn't even a comic book guy back when those comics were out. You know, like, I became a comic book guy as an adult, you know,
right
because I got introduced to him by a roommate that was into comics. Several
Never
of them,
too late.
It isn't. I want to say that made me think about, you know, speaking about your kid and talking about, you know, that upbringing. It makes me think that, yeah, I do remember like a teenage Nate and our college age Nate, you know, in Sufi Nun Squad. But in the books, you know, you referenced that you spent time in Alabama and Mississippi. And so I'm wondering, in a comic book way, I guess, can you give us your origin story and
Sure.
How you viewed these things when you were a kid, and maybe like something you saw in your parents' generation that happened?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so yeah, my basic Arkansan timeline is that, our family, we were an Air Force family. Like, that's why the Powells moved to North Little Rock and Jacksonville in the early 70s. So I was born in 78. And then when I was 2, moved to Montana. Then when I was 5, moved down to Montgomery, Alabama. And then right before 5th grade started in 1988, we moved back to North Little Rock after my dad retired from the Air Force. And so that's when I personally really put down roots. We actually moved back into the house that I lived in when I was a baby. So it was a nice sense of continuity. When I look back on old photos as like a 1-year-old, it's, you know, they're not things that I actively remember, and yet it's just imprinted with, you know, with the rest of my memories in that house. But yeah, like my parents are baby boomers from northern Mississippi. And so I guess importantly, like as a kid in the 80s in Alabama, and this is frankly also my origin story with working on the March trilogy. My personal history is basically that, like, my parents, and also to a degree my schooling in Alabama, I did get a basic working knowledge of civil rights movement history, mostly from my parents. But as is very common for white baby boomers who were parents in the 80s, who hadn't yet unpacked the baggage of their experiences or their complicity in the 1950s and 60s, they did a good job at their level, but a lot, like, it came with a lot of disclaimers to be like, oh, but that was a different time. Don't make connections there's a direct line from 20 years ago to today. Don't worry about that. This is not that. But I didn't have the vocabulary at the time, but not only was the specter, the shadow of, organized, legally instituted segregation very close, but, still, like, very, as is quite present in Arkansas today and Indiana, where I live. Like, visible signs of organized white supremacy are everywhere once you know where to look. And so reckoning with this history, these anecdotes, and these experiences, that was sort of like my first case of cognitive dissonance, maybe as a 7 or 8 year old, of getting a white baby boomer interpretation of how they processed, or how they were taught to process, the civil rights movement, and having it not line up necessarily with locations I had visited as a kid that might just be 3 miles down from my house, or grainy black and white footage and photography that I had already seen. And so when the time came to, like, work with John Lewis and Andrew to do the March trilogy, I felt like it became a personal mission to destroy that intergenerational miseducation, to destroy that sense of disconnection between the near past and the present. And I think that's only become more urgent as a parent, especially once I realized how quickly time passes, and how, like, for right now, the way time is completely distended, and there really is no recent past. We are still living in the recent past. And, for the next decade, like, we haven't escaped an era. We are in the middle of the fight for our lives.
Yes, absolutely. And so, well, that brings right into where I was going to ask, what brought you and John and Andrew together to make this series, and, kind of give me the origin of how that got started. But also, I guess, before we get there, that wasn't your first graphic novel. Like, right. When did you first start working as a graphic novelist? What was your first publication? And tell me how that went from, like, the nervousness of releasing it to, like, this is your idea, and telling your folks or sharing with your friends. Like,
well, I started drawing comics right before I turned 12. My best friend Mike Lyerly, who still living in Little Rock, living the life, he'd been drawing comics for a couple years before me. And I had been drawing for a long time and was obviously a comic book nerd already, but it actually took him saying the words, like, we should make comics together. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is it. And I really, I never looked back from that moment. So we got really serious and, frankly, really disciplined at a very early age.
What age is that?
That would have been, like, 7th grade is when we really hit it, like age 12. Yeah. And at the beginning of 9th grade, we self-published our first comic, which was like a dystopian guns and boobs comic called DOA. And Michael Tierney's shops were, he was gracious enough at the peak of the comics industry to provide a little bit of shelf space for us to sell our DIY project. But also, like, at the time, that was the launch of Image Comics, a creator-owned, completely independent,
remember
line.
that.
That was at the beginning of the summer, and our book was released a few months after that. But already some of our young hero cartoonists who had become, like, overnight millionaires were already kind of blowing their deadlines. And for young, broke comic book nerds, it made us so mad And there was part of it where we're like, and we can like, let's go ahead and face it. Like we can draw as well as several of these like second string and third string cartoonists. So we allowed our indignation to motivate us to stay on a schedule. We're like, we're going to set a bi-monthly deadline and we're going to put out a comic every 2 months. And we did. And so that dovetails with getting more involved with underground punk in 1992, moving into 93. And so a lot of the attendant politics and ethics, particularly like do it yourself, really came alive. So I self-published for 10 years, started working with other publishers, and finally started doing longer, super long form books, like a full graphic novel. Basically, once Sufi Nun Squad went defunct in 2006, all of a sudden my life could now be restructured and I could afford to draw a 200-page story. The origin story for March, it starts that year in 2008. It was about 2 years before I showed up on the radar for it. So Andrew Iden, who's the co-writer of March and the creator of the concept, he was a staffer for Congressman Lewis, and this was during a re-election campaign. And basically, like, this is a little bit of a low point in Congressman Lewis's like public perception, but also the freshness of the memory of his social contributions. It's easy to forget this. And a lot of that is actually because March kind of did what it set out to do and revitalized so much of this history. But everywhere on the campaign trail, there were a lot of questions about, like that underline the need to represent and revitalize the history of the civil rights movement, and specifically the role of young people in it, and how to reach out using mass media in a new, effective way. And basically, Andrew got made fun of gently for being a comic book nerd one day, and John Lewis stuck up for him and was like, don't make fun of him. There was a comic book during the movement when I was a teenager, and it was very influential. And it wound up being this 1956 comic about the Montgomery bus boycotts, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery story, which was in some ways a primer for organized nonviolence, which sort of gave a brief history and a how-to. And it was actually used by Jim Lawson, by Dr. King, by organizers of some of the earliest nonviolence workshops and training sessions. And was literally sold out of the trunk of their cars or given away in church basements, and had a huge role in the early civil rights movement, especially with high school and college students. So Andrew had his mind blown by the discovery of this book and was reading a digitized version of it on the internet that night. And it occurred to him, like, he was captivated by it. And like the answer to every question on the campaign trail, it seemed, was that John Lewis needed to do a comic. And basically the next day, like he hounded him for months, and John Lewis was like, maybe. But eventually he was like, all right, if you do it with me, we'll do it. So they worked up a rough script over the next year and a half or so. They signed a deal with no artist, with my longtime publisher, Top Shelf. And I remember reading that press release while I was finishing Any Empire, and the Silence of Our Friends. And I was like, oh, what a cool project. March, like with John Lewis and Snick, excellent. Well, back to work. And like, it didn't occur to me that there was no artist on the project yet. But thankfully,
you're not an opportunist.
Yeah, for sure. My publisher called me about a week later to make sure I read it, the press release, and strongly suggested that I try out for the role of artist. And some of those reasons were that I can do pretty realistic, detailed and accurate work that is also cartoony and expressive. And also I really like getting into subjective, sensory experiences, and exploring memory. Like a lot of the more personal and intimate storytelling work I do, kind of would help offset the, hard nonfiction historical component of the book, and help humanize and draw empathy into the characters. So yeah, I tried out, we clicked immediately, and we just never looked back.
Well, your visual style is so awesome. I really enjoyed. I love the deep use of the black and white in that comic book style. And you mentioned Image when it came around. I was dating a really, really cool girl back then, and she introduced me to Shade the Changing Man.
Oh yeah.
Back in those days. And that was like the first time when I thought there was more of a less of a superhero story and more of a just kind of an interesting tale, you know. And so to me, like for your trilogy, even though I'm sure there were plenty of other graphic novelists and comic books before that either referenced real historic events or told them specifically and specifically were written for that. It was the first time I got to experience what I consider like a docuseries with a graphic novel. And so I got to understand the story a little bit deeper and got to have that visualization too. And so that component is something that I honestly missed out in my life before you. You're my first graphic novelist. So I'm real grateful to be able to say that, and that you introduced me to this and how much each time another project came out, what it meant to me in my own personal way too, like the Swallow Me Whole series and your work about like bipolar and schizophrenia and mental health that people that I absolutely adore and love have to deal with. And so I understand the subtle nuances of the things that were in that book because I've seen it in their lives. And so to see reality meet this format to me was kind of a throwback to that time when like you said, like all of a sudden comic books weren't just DC and Marvel, they weren't just superheroes. Here's a cool story. It's like all of a sudden there's this dude Trent Reznor on the scene and he's got 9-inch nails and we got to figure out where to go from here.
Right. Well, this is an important point actually, is like when, obviously like I was way into superheroes until I was maybe like 15. And really I just got more interested in like punk and making zines and being a teenager in other ways. But I can't stress enough how much growing up as an Arkansas kid pre-internet, I literally had no idea that comics existed that weren't superhero comics.
Me either.
The furthest out I usually got was the original run of Ninja Turtles or, Cerebus the Aardvark. Sure. And so there was an awareness there on the fringes, but even when I became disinterested in superhero stories as a reader and a creator around like 94 to 95, I didn't really have a frame of reference to recognize that comics are a medium and a format and that you can just communicate about anything. So really that coincided with graduating from high school and leaving Arkansas and getting exposed, from other places and through other people to the fact that comics are unlimited in their potential as far as subject matter, stylistic approach. And having said that, it's kind of cool that a lot of friends and peers who I grew up and moved into this field with, some people like they still make weird far out books. And if they're lucky, still also are putting in time writing or drawing a Marvel or DC superhero book. And it's interesting to see my generation's creative perspective return to these superhero properties and actually try to make the stories that they wish they could have been exposed to when they were younger.
So I'm curious, going to the subject matter of the book, Save It for Later. I know that, man, you most likely felt just compelled to tell some of those stories and to have some of those memories written down. I'm wondering, I guess the real question is, when exactly did it come concrete to you? And then how did that process go where you were like, now I'm going to share not only a story in a graphic novel, but I'm sharing a part of my private life. I'm sharing my children's views. I'm sharing my personal views. Like I'm, without getting real political or saying even the person's name who used to be in charge or whatever, you approach that subject matter. So now it's like, I know that you're so emotionally connected to John's story because he became your friend, your family friend, like your daughter's first friend, maybe that was outside of the family. Like you said, you know, the first name that she said, that wasn't mommy or daddy, you know, like that I'm sure was just an emotional release. But like for this one, like, when did you go, you know what? Okay. You know, I can tell this story. And then you go to your daughters and say, hey, can dad tell this story with all of us together? Or you just say, dad needs to do this, like, get on board. This is what's happening. You know,
this is the crucial question. Yeah. Like when you're getting into actually crystallizing the concept that would become this book, was recognizing that on one level, as somebody who has always benefited from either like writing in my sketchbook or journal or making comics or zines for me, I can try, you know, like I was not and am not interested in explicitly telling stories about my life. Like, who cares?
right.
But the real point here was there was a personal value and need that I had to write and draw a lot of this stuff down. But when making the conscious decision to actually turn them into comics and then organize those comics into a book, for me, the defining moment that helped settle it was simply the fact that, like, and the central purpose behind the book is the fact that my experiences and my family's experiences, while they are specific and individual, the vast majority of those experiences were so broadly shared across so many American families, and again, generally across a great portion of the political spectrum,
Sure.
that I don't want to call them near universal, but I want to emphasize how broadly shared those experiences were. And those are some of the things that were the first conversational components that we started shutting up about. We felt like there wasn't enough bandwidth because there were much more important, larger public issues that needed to be addressed, which is true. But if you don't carve out the space to share those experiences, the application of our social and political reality in your private life and in your family's life and in your child's development, you know, then you can't resolve and deal with those. So in a way, this is a way of like consecrating space, like carving out space so that conversations can get reactivated and thrive. That was my main issue. The reason why my kids are depicted as like unicorns and ponies or fox deer or whatever they are, as equestrians, is there's a basic consent issue. Like, my kids are too young to consent to being depicted. And like, I'm mindful on a basic level, but also because I'm not on fire to draw a memoir of my life. So I was like, that's one way to skirt around it and not worry about it. Like, when I'm really talking about my kids, I'm also talking about all the young people in everyone's life. And another issue was simply like, yes, there is like, the subtext of this is like having young people in your life come of age in an era of so much social and political turmoil in a fight for the survival of democracy. It comes with a very acute sense of like the loss of magic, wonder, innocence, whether or not some of that is an illusion anyway. Because frankly, in Parenthood, you see how much more kids notice than you give credit for them noticing. Right. But, you know, like, it made sense to have unicorn children when a lot of that issue is like, yeah, the grownups have lost their unicorn horns, man. Like, you know, we're slogging through it, but thank goodness there's this idealism and this vision that kind of cuts through the BS, that allows young people to ask the questions that everybody needs to be asking.
Man, I thought the use of the unicorn, and I thought she was a fawn too, a deer as well.
Oh yeah,
I thought that was absolutely unique, and it really gave me that sense too. Like, it took a lot of the weight off of that's one child. It made it seem like just the unicorn part, just the making it making your daughter a unicorn helps us to go, okay, then this is a fictional character, but saying some real things.
Right.
And we also can feel what you felt as a dad, going, I'm not sure if I want to actually draw my daughter for this
Oh,
publication.
sure, yeah.
And then if she looks back on it, her seeing a unicorn might be taken different by not just everyone in the world that reads it, but also by the subject matter, by her herself. You know, how could you not, as your daughter, enjoy being the fact that she gets to be a unicorn in this, but to also get to be such an active figure in the story, to be the subject matter as well, and to have a voice like that, to speak up like she saw John Lewis do, her hero, and she saw her dad, of course, is her hero, do, and to work to do this on her own. And so that makes me think about the questions that I had about making the protest from the original protest march that she said that she wanted to take. Reading through that multiple times, it made me think back when, like when we lost TC, how everyone was at Whitewater upstairs making all these different posters, and how some, you know, were like, why do you always wear a size 9? Or, you know, TC sayings, and some were so poignant and so direct and so simple with just like a few words, you know, like raised by kittens, you know. And so I really enjoyed how you made a point to explain how you want these posters to give a certain response, and that you needed to give a very short, we can do this, or, you know, something to it. So to me, my question is a couple. What were the most poignant protest signs you saw administratively, like throughout the Trump protests and the BLM protests and the actual rights, the birthrights protests and women's marches and everything? So out of all those different protest signs, you know that you were at them, and you know you looked around and saw certain signs, and certain ones really struck home with you, you know. And so I'm wondering if there were some signs during that time that you looked over and really hit you, and then what were the ones that your daughter, or you see maybe other children's handiwork making, and then what was the favorite one that you carried yourself?
I'd say the favorite one that I carried, which I still had most of our signs in our garage, because I knew that I would be a fool to think that I would not need them this year, next year, the year after that, the year after that,
next election.
But I'm not taking credit for this slogan, but I definitely paraphrased it from something that I was really driven by in another sign. I think it's at the end, there's a photograph of my kid and I at a protest at our local representative's office against border detention camps and concentration camps. But it was simply the notion that moral clarity is not partisan. And so and a lot of this is specific to living in a nominally progressive, cool college town surrounded by white supremacists, with a lot of the same kind of like back and forth dynamics like shared between Indiana, where I live now, and Arkansas, in terms of like this false idea of protected bubbles of coolness. But what has become increasingly important to me, I think, when engaging with such a mixed bag of people, especially in a college town, but which has an incredibly high like poverty rate, like really, really serious substance abuse issues, mental health issues, a real serious problem with, you know, just like capitalism pushing people out of spaces and causing housing crises. You can really cut through to a lot of people who you would otherwise dismiss when you're ready to talk about these issues in a particular way. And I think I was really struck over the past 5 or 6 years with the idea of no longer shying away from the word moral or morality. And I think a lot of that is like being so repulsed by using that word as a product of being a child of the 80s and 90s and growing up through the Reagan Bush years and having particular associations with the word moral or morality, and having that to do really with the rise of, you know, neoconservative fundamentalist, Christianity affecting politics and society. But frankly, it's been a delightful return to embracing social and political issues from a moral perspective. And I think I've learned a lot from John Lewis by that, and recognized the limitations, but also the specific strengths that he carried, particularly compared with other leaders of the civil rights movement, in his viewing most of these issues through a simpler moral framework and less through practical, realpolitik frameworks or whatever. But yeah, like, I'm largely most guided by moral clarity is not partisan, as a means of taking down the temperature and clearing space to actually have a conversation. My kid was most moved and inspired, especially in migrant concentration camp protests, by the more popular slogan, "Families belong together," which, and this is in the book, I was, able to actually come to a place of agreement with like a Confederate flag, belt buckle wearing Bubba, who approached me on the courthouse square while my kid and I were walking around doing a 2-person protest. Like that set off a lot of lights in my head. The fact that, like, by not bringing any of my own baggage to the table, when someone actually asks a question, by meeting them there, so much more good can be done than I was expecting.
That's so true. Were you able to find any of that over the past 4 years in your peer group that you didn't expect, or in your family that you didn't expect, or to have that uncomfortable conversation because you see that somebody is starting to lean libertarian or lean Republican, or start to maybe change who they had been previously because they feel like they could start to come out more? Because I saw in a couple of people I know how they just started to become a lot more into stirring up the muck, or
Right.
into trolling, and
Right.
trying to get people to say stuff. And it's like, for a while it was like, are you really this way, or are you just trying to be unique? Are you just trying
Sure.
to not be the left?
Well, I think I'm pretty fortunate in that, in terms of my actual friends, and like so much of this is like geographically remote and spread out now. But I didn't, within my family unit and within my friend groups, I did not experience that sense of betrayal and loss, by which people were drawing lines in the sand and people were having to turn their backs on other people. I, have many experiences, within, whether it's quietly within my neighborhood, having those experiences, or in the broader sense. But I was thankfully kind of spared that, which is just like heartbreaking. Anytime I would have to like check up with a friend and they would have a story like that, in terms of having to part ways with someone in their own family, as the temperature in the room got so much higher. I want to open up a couple of these questions, because I see we got.
Yeah, I was just about to ask. That's what I was hoping on here. So
our first, I'll hit
if
this
you can
first.
see them too, you go ahead.
So we've got, would you describe Save It for Later as making good trouble? Yes, and it's like good trouble being one of the key phrases that John Lewis has been able to kind of bring back to the forefront, that when you see something that is not just, that is not right, you have an obligation and a duty to speak up, speak out, make good trouble, necessary trouble. Yes, and I guess, like, in the preface to the book, it's funny, but I still stand by it. I kind of like try to put my foot down that this book is neither a parenting guide or an activist handbook, while the vast majority of the book is describing my subjective experiences, trying to figure out the ropes of parenting my kids through this, and trying to find creative solutions, especially as, like, a lonesome nerd who has a limited amount of in real life friends these days, trying to make some kind of noise during the middle of a work day. Like, a lot of it is creative solutions. So yeah, like, there's a strong component of good trouble in there. And a lot of it really is like, I think the strongest part of that is like looking for solutions that work at your level in your particular circumstances. So there are a lot of things that have to do with like spinning out into enough of a rage because of awful news and social media that you're not actually able to not only do something constructive against that bad news, but also the mundane stuff you have to do during the day is kind of shot too. So trying to identify the moment, the tipping point where all of that can kind of fall off, and then trying to salvage what you can of your constructive energy. I mean, like I've always felt that like anger is really good and really useful. It's a matter of knowing what to do with your anger and your indignation. It's not something that needs to be, necessarily, like stifled or repressed. It's a matter of understanding, constructive, positive outcomes using the energy of your anger.
So I don't know if you can see over in the chat, we had a couple of other things pop up from Karen. We got the unicorn works for me. How did your children respond? And then morality, much like we let Bush #1 take the American flag away from us. I would say, what are your thoughts and what were her thoughts on that? And then, let's talk about flags. Do you feel like I think when the towers fell, I looked at the flag differently than I did before. When the last president won, I looked at the flag differently. When Bush took office, I looked at the flag differently. When things turned blue and Biden won, even though like Biden wasn't my favorite choice. He was the guy. He was the guy we could vote for, and instead of die. And so for me, the flag looked differently to me that day. The big ones in front of the banks blowing in the wind. It was like, right. It meant something to you. And so I'm wondering, like, what flags harmed you the most that you saw? And then, like, when did your, like, feelings change about the flag during this or about these images?
Yeah, this is a good question. This is something that actually surprised me in that generally speaking, I'm just blanket anti-flag, period. And I don't even mean that in terms of in relation to national identity. I think flags as a general concept are a bad idea. But my basic answer is that I think one of my central takeaways from the last 5 or 6 years are that, like growing up through underground hardcore punk, especially of the 1990s, and being shaped by the first Gulf War and by the Reagan and Bush presidencies, and then by a lot of the like wool being pulled over the eyes through the neoliberal, neoconservative conjoining through the 90s. I've always had a pretty consistent sense of that at times would seem cartoonish and too anthemic in terms of where all of this was headed. And I think in the last 5 years, one of my main takeaways was simply that the punks were undeniably right about all of this and where it was headed. And there's very little comfort in that because that doesn't do or change anything. However, one of the weirdest experiences that I couldn't deny anymore was because of the 2010s recontextualization and appropriation of the American flag, which this is like the central chapter of this book is an essay called About Face, which basically, among other things, gives kind of a timeline and a family tree that leads us to this sort of like fascist, color-free authoritarian flag with all of its adjacent paramilitary symbols. I mean, it begins with practical active duty stylistic considerations that then filters down into law enforcement and paramilitary groups, and then filters into like apolitical consumer pop culture. And it has served to normalize a constant fascist and paramilitary presence culturally and, through our aesthetic and style. But oddly, by seeing so clearly this transition and by this normalization of an authoritarian or like proto-fascist alternative, to the American flag. It hasn't changed my relationship with the flag necessarily, but it's in recognizing that being forced to see so clearly how easily the most readily assumed structures in our society can be lost filled me with the closest thing to patriotism I have ever felt. And I'm not a very patriotic fellow, but
Sure.
it's interesting how the relative shifts and our reactions to those shifts, especially when you're talking about having culture shaped by symbols, has resulted in a more fluid relationship with the symbols that were often taken for granted. But yeah, in general, I'm just blanket anti-flag.
And that part I connected with so much because there are people in my life that I have seen that have gone that way, and there are people I see around town that have gone that way, and I see those flags around town, and like my friend in Sherwood, like his neighbor has a 10-foot banner of Trump riding on top of a trunk of a tank with like missiles behind him, and flames and everything, like he's some kind of huge superhero from this movie, and it's like they immediately moved that from their front yard to like the carport once they lost, and then they like pretty soon it's going to disappear from the carport, because
I don't know about that, man.
Their pride inches back, and then it's like then in 2024 it comes right back out, like right back onto the lawn again, so I would say, since we were on limited time, I want to say, what would you think we could do to prepare for the good trouble that's coming up soon, and to honestly to really work hard? Like, I feel like, no offense to the Democrats, you absolutely work hard, but I just don't know if you're working hard and dirty and clever enough sometimes, because every now and then something like this gets past us, and it should never have happened. Well, so how are we screwing up, and what can we do to get in better good trouble?
That's a good point. Number one is recognizing there's a difference between the people and between institutionalists, at the local, state, and federal level, but people who are not particularly bothered by the potential outcome of an authoritarian state or even a fascist state, and recognizing that, historically, there are many examples of people coming from the center and from the moderate left making space for and enabling the structures that allow fascism to take place. So basically, it's recognizing that our leaders are not going to save us. And I hope that everyone really understands this clearly. Our leaders will not save us.
That's right.
But I guess more importantly, when you're talking about preparing for the good trouble that's coming, it's here. This never stopped. So this is a moment.
Very true.
I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. Like,
me too.
Our social connections have been destroyed in real space because of the pandemic. And so, yes, there is a constant degree of risk and so many considerations to make. But I think it's whenever possible renormalizing so many of the habits and practices that we've carried with us for these past 7 years of necessary protest, and to recognize that nothing has changed. We just have to keep up the pressure, put in, and by this, I don't mean like, I think people get discouraged because there is this sort of false dichotomy between someone who is politically active and someone who is not an activist. And I think I try to even avoid the word activist, because I think that a lot of this change, not a lot of this change. I think that a lot of action can be successful in terms of preserving democracy and pushing policies that most people support just by people showing up. So what I think is most valuable is just to emphasize, show up. If you're able to show up, recognize that other people are going to ass out. And so you show up for them and recognize that at a certain point, you're going to fall through and you're not going to be able to do it, or you're going to have an excuse, and know that someone else, a stranger, is thinking the same thing you're thinking, and they're going to show up for you. So I just want to urge people, not only not to get complacent, but to really understand the alarms are ringing as loud as they've ever been ringing.
They are, absolutely, and it is so important. Man, thanks so much for that. That is exactly the type of answer that I expected and was looking for with that type of question. I would like to wrap this up by mentioning something that's a surprise that I've been talking about some artist friends of mine for quite a while, and you've been talked about by these artists and aren't aware. Well, you know, we've got the mural space on 7th Street now that just started many years ago, like back in 2014 with Hamid and Tanya and Ron Mack putting together that space. And then Jose and Jermaine and Tanya and Talia and a whole bunch of other people came back and are championing it. And it seems like, to me, what spoke to me the most about that space was how each time that these groups came through to protest at the Capitol and they went through and trashed it, like Jose and the other guys would be there before daylight hit it and repair it so that their damage would not see the light of day. Yeah. And so that and each time they did, they would make another larger panel to go next to it. And they sent the message out. It's like, every time you do this, we're going to build this bigger. Wow. We're going to keep making it bigger. We're going to extend this. And so now, I don't know if you've seen it, but it goes all the way down that entire lower 2 bridges area. Amazing. Underneath there by Whitewater on both sides of the street. And so it's been great to have the mayor's support on this, to have the city support on this, to have, you know, Union Pacific support on this, and potentially, but basically for the city to come together and have this as a new space, you know, like now people are beginning to appreciate it. And so what we've been talking about since we've been sitting on top of these bridges and seeing this new work first start during the movement last year was how I proposed that I'd really love us to take one of those bridges and make it just exactly the same stencil as Pettus Bridge, right? Mm-hmm. But then I'd like to have it kind of marked out and made into the John Lewis Bridge. And I was wondering if maybe we could talk an Arkansas artist into maybe creating some stencils to pass off to these guys. So that it has basically your mark of approval. And then we could, pass these along and get the actual bridge there named as the John Lewis Bridge.
Of course I support that. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to that, and we'll talk more about that on a personal time. Let me just see. I got one other thing. The anonymous attendee had to mention that you had me at the punks were undeniably right.
It's
I love
true.
that. I say all the time, like you have no idea how great it is for me to see that, in my opinion, all the best parents and all of the best teachers were punk rockers, were skateboarders, were musicians. But how do we convince this new generation that you're the people that are going to do this? You're going to be the best parents in the future. The fact that you're paying attention now, the fact that you're doing this, do you have more faith now in the youth than you used to?
I do. And a lot of it is recognizing that it's really about the parents. It's about me learning to shut up and listen. And basically recognizing that I will be out of touch about some things. I will be the dinosaur. I will say messed up stuff, and I will get called out by my kids for it. And so that's the time to shut up, listen, and follow. That's what makes me feel the best. We did just get the zip with the time.
You got it. Well, man, thank you so much. And I completely get that too. I get it from my sister, who's 17 years younger than me. And I'm only 17 years younger than my mother. And so she told me in her 50s, basically, there's no adults. We're just trying to figure this out. And so I enjoy your youth-like wisdom. And I'm so thankful that you shared your daughter's incredible youth wisdom as well. So thanks so much for doing this with us. And thanks for everyone at CALS for making this happen with the Six Bridges Book Festival. Thanks for Lauren. Thanks for our tech, Nathan. Thanks for everybody that proposed these questions in our chats. And thanks so much for telling us to have a nice and creepy Halloween. We appreciate you. And thanks for all the kudos on the conversation. We really appreciate you coming, Nate Powell. Thanks so much for doing this.
Happy to be here.
I look forward to talking to you more in the future. And the next book, when's it coming out? You got a name yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's called Fall Through. It's got some deep Little Rock roots, but it'll be out in 2024. Yeah.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. I look forward to it. Well, thanks again, Nate. You have a great night.
You too. Take it easy.
Bye-bye, guys.